Meeting open, and we apparently have a quorum. Could we just run through in the chambers? Councillor Pascoe, Councillor Bunting, Her Worship the Mayor, Councillor McPherson. Who do we have on Zoom?
We have Councillor Naidu Ralph, Councillor Thompson, Mangai Hill and Councillor Van Oosten. And I also believe we do have Councillor O'Leary just sitting in the background at this moment.
Right, thank you. That's excellent. Look, I also have apologies for Councillor Wilson for absence, but that is noted. That is on official council business, so if that can be noted. Are there any further apologies that we've... Deputy Mayor Taylor has put his apology in. Are there any further apologies we've received? Councillor Forsyth. And I'll... during the meeting have a quick look at my emails, because I think sometimes people... Okay. Right. I move that the apologies be sustained. Second to Councillor McPherson. All those in favour, those to the contrary, carried. Confirmation of agenda as before you, and that we're obviously primarily dealing, of course, with the Hamilton Stormwater bylaw and bylaw. I will move that the agenda be confirmed. Seconded, Councillor Pascoe. All those in favour, this to the contrary, carried. Do we have any declaration of interest, albeit if there are none? We now move to the confirmation of the Hearings and Engagement Committee open minutes on page 5. And you'd like to move Councillor Bunting, seconded Councillor Pascoe. All those move that those minutes be received and adopted. All those in favour, please say aye. Those to the contrary, carried. We now move on to the confirmation of the Hearings and Engagement Committee open minutes on the 23rd of November 2020. I will move that they be recorded as true and correct minutes. Second to Councillor McPherson. Who was at that meeting? What we normally have to do as a normal procedure. Sorry, I'm going to... Yeah, moved. Is this the 23rd of November?
Yep.
Yeah, these are the 23rd of November ones, right? That is then moved by Councillor Bunting and seconded by myself. All those in favour say aye. And in an ideal world, I'll go back to the other ones just purely. That was moved. Oh yeah, moved by Pascoe, and who was that seconded by? Moved by Bunting and seconded Pascoe. That's right. You were at that meeting. Apologies. We now go to the minutes. Is that the one of the 1st of December? Right. And I will move, and seconded by Councillor Pascoe. All those in favour?
This is the 1st of December minutes.
This is the 1st of December, right? Obviously, what I'm just double checking in terms of people who were there and present. I'll put that. All those in favour, those to the contrary, carried. We now move to the Hamilton Stormwater bylaw. Since when I understand we have 2 submitters. Mari, would you like to join us at the table so that you're available to answer questions if we do subsequent to the submitters? All right. Now, who is our first? Bruce Mackay. He's on Zoom. Welcome, Mr. Mackay. You have obviously up to 5 minutes if you just want to share your perspectives, and then members of the committee may or may not ask you questions of clarification. We're in your hands, sir.
Okay, thank you. I represent the Kukuturāhe Education Trust, sometimes called the Fairfield Project. So I'll be raising concerns that they have. I also live on the same gully at the lower end of it, on the Kukatarahi stream. So some of these concerns are also mine. First up, the Fairfield project is concerned about incremental infill in gullies and the ongoing effects of this, and particularly in this case, stormwater volumes and flow rate increases, which cause issues around sedimentation, erosion and habitat damage. And I just draw your attention to the fact that the Kukatarahi stream is an important site for NIWA for research purposes for intergiant kookaburra, and there's also other native fish in the stream, including long-tailed, long-finned eel. The sort of thing that we're thinking about is, for instance, recently there's been new houses built on the gully and there's extra stormwater coming off those. Diocesan School has also put in brand new tennis courts, and all of that extra runoff has been pumped into the gully, and in that case is actually causing erosion. So that's around your issue 2. Second point that I have to make is that we're concerned about swimming pool discharges, and in particular Fairfield College has a large swimming pool, and so does Diocesan School, both on the same gully. And discharge to the gully without any treatment, although I think Fairfield Colleges does run into a bit of a wet area. We see this kind of as an opportunity to develop treatment wetlands within the gully system that could actually resolve some of that problem. But besides those swimming pools, there's obviously lots of other swimming pools around the area, smaller ones that discharge. I have a swimming pool, it's been there for like 25 years, and every time it's backwashed to the stormwater into the gully. That really needs to change, and I don't have any qualms about having to upgrade that system to meet any requirements whereby it's put into the discharges are put through into the sewage system or some other way of treating them. So that was around your issue 3. My third point is that we are concerned at the large number of private discharges of stormwater into the gully system. Nearly every property has one or more stormwater pipes going into the gully, and this applies all around me and to my neighbours, but also all the way up the Kukatarahi Gully system. A lot of these have not been put in with any consent or anything. I don't know whether they even require consent. But the issue is that they break quite often and deteriorate over time, again leading to erosion. I've had 4 cases of this just in my immediate neighbourhood in the last 10 to 15 years, where there's been serious erosion caused by broken stormwater pipes. Okay, so that was issue 4, and my 4th point is around your issue 4 and 5, to do with the high-risk stormwater discharges. We totally agree with trying to identify high-risk stormwater discharge areas and monitoring and maintaining those appropriately. The sorts of things that we would like to see is identifying where stormwater discharges pipes are located on erosive soils and steep gullies, and also where they're located in proximity to ecologically valuable or vulnerable waterways. And finally, just around your issue 6 and 7, really to do with defining your definitions in the whole thing. Is that you refer to at some stage public drains, and I think we need to distinguish between what are public drains and what are essentially modified natural waterways. Public drains are one thing in terms of maintenance, but when you're frequently maintaining what are essentially natural waterways, that can do quite a lot of damage. And historically, there's been constant maintenance of waterways, removing vegetation, removing timber out of the waterways, in theory to make the water flow more freely, but in actual fact, that does a lot of damage to wildlife habitat. And so I would like to see a definition of your drain systems, either as public drains, one thing, completely artificial, and two, modified natural waterways, which should have a different maintenance protocol on them. So that's a summary of some of what I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive submission you have made. Do I have any questions from members of the Hearings Committee? We're obviously going to be following up a number of these issues with our staff team when we conclude a particular public hearing. Are there any other questions? Anyone on Zoom? Oh, sorry. Is there anyone on Zoom?
Nobody on Zoom, just
No. Councillor McPherson.
It's on your thing there, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought you'd be very experienced after all these engagement and hearing committees.
Always, thank you for your assistance. Always appreciated, Councillor McPherson.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Mackay, thanks for your submission. Your points, you touched on erosion at the end, so I'm presuming that's the biggest potential concern that you or the Fairfield project has. What about water quality, the quality of stormwater going in? Is that an issue as well?
Absolutely. Erosion's not necessarily the Fairfield project's biggest concern. It's one of my concerns because I live on sand that's about 10 to 15 metres deep, and it's pure sand and erodes really quickly. But the Fairfield project, we effectively have under our control a large part of the Kuku-Taruhi stream, and we're really concerned about the effects on the native fish within that stream system. There are hundreds, this is what NIWA has told us, there are hundreds of giant kōkapu in that stream. And the danger is that by incremental stormwater increases and incremental encroachment on the gully system, their habitat becomes damaged and their population reduces and so on. So, yes, water quality is essential for, good quality water is essential for longfin eel and also beneficial obviously for giant kōkapu and other native fish.
Often when there's a stormwater event, probably this morning or overnight, would be a sudden flush of water going in. Is there any sort of baffle or catchment system that slows that up when it comes from either private houses or say off roads?
No.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that extra info.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you first for your submission. I was just wanting to get some more clarification around the effect of properties which currently have stormwater going going into the gully system. Essentially, would the longer term solution be that the stormwater is redirected away out of the gully system, or what is the longer term solution here?
Personally, I think it would be an almost impossible task because there are literally hundreds of stormwater pipes going to the gully systems. Just in this one system, there's hundreds. You would have to inspect each one of them and see what the opportunity is and the long-standing use. Like our house was built in 1964. The stormwater was put in to the gully at that stage. So that's, what's that? Nearly 60 years of stormwater going into the gully. To suddenly turn around and say to people, well, you've got to redirect that, could be a big ask. I don't know, that would be up to council, but my feeling is that it's a huge issue, and even just somebody going up the streams and monitoring each of those to make sure they're not broken from time to time would actually be quite an important consideration. You do have teams of staff who go up the streams. Perhaps it's a job that they can do at the same time, I don't know.
So if they're not broken, then they have less impact
Well,
on
less erosive impact, Sarah.
Okay, but you still have the impact on the hydrology of the stream if you suddenly have a lot of water coming in and it's of a different temperature, etc. And in terms of, and I guess, is there any stormwater that you're aware of that directly comes from the road as well into these gullies?
Yes. Right,
Okay.
and I'm on the confluence of two of the main stream and as well as a smaller stream. There's a 300 diameter stormwater discharge comes in off Comrades Road, and every time that comes into this small side stream, it dominates the flow. And it's quite often smelly when it first starts, so there's all sorts of pollutants going down into that. And I imagine there's quite a number of those around in other parts of the gully system too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Van Oosten and then Councillor Pascoe, followed by Mayor Southgate. Councillor Van Oosten.
Good morning, and thank you for your submission. I listened intently about the school pools and the concern that you have of their backwash going into the gully, and yours and other formal pools. My question is with regard to the less formal pools now, the kind of put-up pools that popping up into backyards, etc., that don't have those formalised backwash functions or emptying functions, and generally they come up in the early spring and go down sometime around autumn in terms of all of that water, and they're quite large. What do you think the impact of those might be on both your gully and the rest of the system?
It's hard to say. I've only seen one or two of those, and I don't know quite how they get rid of their backwash water. I presume they pipe it into the stormwater catch pit or something like that on their properties. I'm not familiar with that, but I imagine it would. I mean, if that's what's happening, then it's going to have the same sort of impact as all the other things that I've mentioned. It's going to add to pollutants going into the stream. It's going to add to water volumes, perhaps minimally actually on that, because it's not going to be, except at the end of the season when they discharge the whole pool. Yeah.
And in terms of the chemicals that will be in that water and mixing with the stream water, what kind of impact will that have on the wildlife and the stream life that you talk about?
Generally, when you do a backwash, the pool is quite often at the low end of the cycle in terms of chlorination. So there's less chlorine going in, but there's other chemicals that are also added to that water.
Thank you. there's
Yeah.
adequate response.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pascoe?
And that was my question, Chair.
Right, thank you. Your Worship, the Mayor.
Thank you for your submission, and you've made most of what I was going to ask has been answered. But the distinction between public drains and natural streams and their course, did you have a view on a preference that council should move towards, or you're obviously very interested in the ecology of the system? So I was wondering whether you had a view on whether some public drains could become open watercourses or vice versa, just in terms of ecology. You know, you understood that, didn't you?
The difference really lies in the origin of the drains. Like natural watercourses have existed all across the landscape. As the landscapes become urbanised, they become receptacles for stormwater, so they're modified. What I would refer to as an urban drain or a public drain is something that's constructed completely de novo. So initially it has zero ecological value in a sense. If you're just cutting a trench in the ground, there's nothing there. Over time, if it's connected to other natural waterways, then yes, there could be potential that those the habitat could improve in those areas, and it does. It does. But fundamentally, in terms of the Resource Management Act, the distinction is actually quite important for protection of natural waterways.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no further questions, thank you very much, Mr Mackay, for your submission to this hearings and engagement session, and obviously the depth of your analysis is very obvious, and that's genuinely appreciated, as you would have sensed by the questions that have been asked. Thank you very much for your time. I now move to...
Will you collect questions from members that they may want to ask staff at the end? Is that what you do?
Yes, no. What we're going to do is we're going through the submitters.
Yeah, and then
obviously there's a series of... So what I think that's the best way to do it, and then we go across to Murray Porter, and then we go from there.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David Lemarquand, who's from Foresight Consulting Limited, which I understand is representing some of the New Zealand oil companies. Can we welcome him? Right, here we go. Right. Yeah, Mr Lemarquand, we're sort of roughly up to 5 minutes, and we're in your hand, and obviously you'll be highlighting aspects of your submission. We're in your hands, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, staff and councillors, chair, and other submitters. Just got, I guess, some discrete matters to point out in terms of the submission. It's probably more focused on some of the actual wording in relation to it. The first one relates to clause 6.3, and where we raised an issue about the matter of that clause, and if you like, the issue about the council reserving a discretion to itself to trump any regional consent or regional plan permitted activity requirements. And we suggested that part be deleted because if there is a discharge consent in place, people have obviously gone through the process. I'm sure the council would have been considered to be an affected party with it, and the same with the permitted activity aspect. If it's a permitted activity into the river, then that process is sorted through the plan. Now, and we're going to go through a review shortly and on the regional plan in any event to relook at all those matters. So part of the response we had back from staff earlier on was a suggestion that they might get rid of that clause altogether. My preference is that they still retain a reference to the regional council consents and permitted activities in there, because that's important. happens in a number of other jurisdictions, like I've just been dealing with recently in Environment Canterbury and Bay of Plenty. This sort of interface, and where people use the stormwater network for a particular discharge, they get a consent from the regional council, and that sorts things out. So the focus is on the policy, on the water quality aspect of it. The council still may have an interest in terms of things like its impact on its infrastructure. So if there's something in terms of the way they were connecting up and damaging it, then that's reasonable that the bylaw then kicks in. If it's something that's going to cause particular corrosion or some other damage to the system, then that's reasonable. Similarly, with probably quantity, if somebody's discharge is substantial, for instance, the oil companies do dewatering when they're changing out tanks. And if they put that down the pipework, then that could be a substantial volume. So you might want to have an issue in terms of the capacity. And what quite often happens in terms of consents that come through the regional level is that you try and avoid periods for when there may be storms, etc. So you look for a window that you can actually start that without causing too many issues. So for 6.3, the wording in the submission is what I'm after. The submission then went on and sought a reference to the environmental guidelines for water discharges, the MFE guidelines. And I know that there was a little bit of pushback from staff in relation to that, and I can accept that. And in my view, it's probably not that necessary to include it in the bylaw. There's already reference in the regional plan in any event for stormwater, but discharges that comply with that are permitted. But you've got in there a section in 8.7 relating to high-risk facilities. I think that's a good idea to have such a clause, because it does enable you to actually pick up some other aspects, particularly in terms of how they might be undertaking their activities on land that may cause particular problems. So that's part of your input. So I'm in favour of what you've got there in terms of the pollution control plan. But for the oil companies, I know in clause B there, where you say you want the pollution control plan to be on the premises, I guess those elements that you've got set out in D won't necessarily all be within the in the service stations in a little plan per se. This is because they run a network, national network, and some of those matters are done through nationally, so they might have access to it via the computer, but it won't necessarily be physically there in place. Certainly, on request, they can furnish those various elements. To me, the key things that should be on site are the spill prevention and spill response plans, and the oil companies have basic flip charts for when those things are there. You want something very simple for the operators on the site when they're there to be able to deal with that. They've got those. There are unmanned sites which are starting to appear now, and I'm aware the EPA are generating a guideline in relation to those sites. But in that situation, obviously, it's going to be whoever's dealing, dispensing their own petrol at the time, etc. The key thing for any spill response has to be in terms of what signage you have in relation to that on that site. So it's slightly different. So in B, I would like to see the deletion of the word on the premises at 8.7b, and then maybe you could consider in D5 there that there be a clear requirement that those spill prevention, spill response procedures are outlined on the site, are available on the site. So those are effectively the points I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submission. I now go to Councillor McPherson for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for noticing so promptly. Look, sorry, Mr. Lamarcond, your first point about the 6.3, wanting that removed, or suggesting it should be removed, is your concern the last half sentence where it says, except where this bylaw requires a higher standard than the regional plan? Is that yes, the essence of it?
That's correct. I'd like to see it stay, apart from that last part of the last sentence. And the reason is because the bylaw doesn't actually specify any standards. The way it would go through that process is through the exercise of discretion and judgment. So there's no clear standard per se in relation to that, because it's actually a process by which you'd work through that with the officers.
Well, isn't there, while there may not be any standards at the moment that this refers to, what if a council subsequently developed higher standards and then proposed for them to be included as a policy, let's say, proposed they be included in this bylaw? That would be out for consultation as an amendment to the bylaw, so you or the oil companies could still have their say at that point, could they not?
They could do, and I'd say, well, in that case, that's when you would put that clause back in.
Okay, thanks. I understand your point. Thank you.
Councillor Pascoe.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your submission today. I just got a question on 8.7b, which is your wish to delete on the premises. And this will be a question perhaps I'll ask the staff after I've asked the question to you. Having an online facility where you would have a manual available either from a computer terminal or an iPad would to me suggest on the premises would be satisfied. Is that something that's possible? And you mentioned both manned and unmanned petrol stations, which I assume are linked anyway with some form of online access.
In terms of unmanned sites, I wouldn't say that there's any online access.
Well, they can go online. I know the unmanned sites. The owners of those facilities can go online and check whether there's been damage and what the fuel levels are. So I assume that they've got some form of online capabilities at each of those stations. But I'm looking at both angles in terms of an online manual satisfying the on the premises request.
Maybe the focus should be accessible on the premises as opposed to being physically there on the premises.
Okay, I'll ask that question. I can ask that question of staff when we move to that part of the hearing. Thank you.
Because one of the matters in D4 there, for instance, maintenance procedures for stormwater interception system. Contracts are run nationally for these, so and at certain intervals, and the actual site itself may not know when precisely what the regime is in relation to that. So, but they are done nationally, so they may have because they have different contractors coming to the site all the time.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, if there are no further questions, Mr. Lamarcond, thank you very much for your submission. That's most appreciated, and highlighting the main concerns you have. Thank you, sir.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, I would now, if Raymond Simpson, did you want to join us at the table as well, with Marie Porter, obviously, and any other members of the staff team? Okay, and then what we will do is I'll presumably get the appropriate one of right, Raymond, just to give a brief sort of overview with regard to the bylaw, and then perhaps to pick up any points that have been made by the two submitters, following which I'll start going round the table for each individual member and around the Zoom in the cloud for any individual members to ask specific questions of you. Right, we're in your hands. I think we need to activate the mics. Yep.
Great. Kia ora koutou. I am Ray Simpson. I'm the Senior Planner for City Waters, and I've been tasked with putting together this or reviewing this stormwater bylaw. I have with me Angus McKenzie from Place Group Environmental. He has been helping me in the process. And I also have Tim Manako, who has been helping us with engagement.
Yeah, Tim Manako is on the Zoom, yep, right.
Yes, that's
fine.
right.
Yep.
And so he has been helping us with our collaboration with Waikato Tainui and with Thork as well. So I just want to, we're a team. So the stormwater bylaw, it needed to be reviewed after 5 years. So it was a new bylaw 5 years ago. We needed to make sure that it was still fit for purpose and it was doing as it intended. Since that 5 years, there's been, I just want to preface that there's been a lot of changes in the environmental space, as well as clearer recognition of Te Ture Whai Mana, the vision and strategy. We've also had 2 more reiterations of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and in particular recently Te Mana o Te Wai. We have a new connections policy as well. We've got high growth, we're observing climate change. So there's all these manner of things that we now need to take into account when we're reviewing our bylaw. So what we did was we got together and we determined how we were going to identify some of those issues. So we did that with our internal staff that work at the coalface. We also needed to make sure that we were aligned sub-regionally, and we got iwi on board for collaboration on how this bylaw needed to shape up and identify those issues. We came up with about 7 issues and then made sort of those changes to the proposed draft bylaw, and we put that out for consultation. That was for a period of 5 weeks. And we also, during that time, we put out, I think it was just over 170 letters to our high-risk facilities, drawing their attention to the fact that there were changes to the bylaw. We also emailed and phoned 13 stream care groups to make sure that they knew that this bylaw was up for review. And of course, there was the public as well, and ongoing collaboration with iwi. We got back 18 submissions, and so we got back 3 from our stream care groups. You've just listened to our submitter from the oil companies, and we got 13 back from the public. We also got 1 community group, I think it was Southeast Kirikiriroa community. So we then sort of had a look at what was coming back from those groups, and so it looked like sort of some of those key themes were around biodiversity for a kick-off. I'd just like to note that the majority of the submitters actually supported the proposed changes at the time, but of course they also raised concern and wanted some changes. So I did sort of group up sort of some of those key concerns. So there was ecological protection, a lot of support for the bylaw. They liked the proposed measures. However, some submitters were kind of looking for, a kind of a risk-based approach to biodiversity. So they weren't necessarily just focused on water quality and sediment quality that might come from stormwater discharges, and also looking around that risk approach, looking for perhaps something like builder certification and better stormwater design. Contaminant control, a lot of submitters really liked the fact that we were putting in those extra measures around contaminant control. We've talked briefly about pools, pop-up pools. And we also added in there, because of our high growth, our building site activities. We don't seem to be nailing that quite as well as what we need to. And wastewater discharges, the importance of enforcement, and I think one submitter also wanted demonstration of compliance with their stormwater devices. Just on those stormwater devices, there was some concern raised around costs and also around pools, so costs of maintaining devices, and also costs of potentially changing your plumbing of your swimming pool so that it was diverted to wastewater. So those were some of the things that were coming up, and of course you heard from our submitter, again, sort of just wanting some certainty associated with guidelines and meeting certain quality standards if they were reflected under the regional plan. And also our submitter raised a really good point about I guess these unmanned sites, and I guess for us the key thing is that people know what they need to have on site to manage a spill, what training people need to have to manage a spill, and how you would respond if there was a spill. So I'd like to thank the submitter for raising those concerns or those solutions. Also, what came out of the consultation, which was, you know, some real gems, is we actually asked the public what they would like to know more information on. So we got some real gems from there in terms of how we might focus our education strategy going forward. So that's been the outcome of us going out and asking our industry, our stream care groups, our communities, what they think of the bylaw.
Thank you. So I'm going to start the question. Just note Eva-Lisa Wright is unable to be here because of an urgent family matter. I'm going to start in terms of the board, although the chair always has discretion on this, but I'll go with Councillor Bunting first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, look, I'll try not to ask all of Dave's questions, but Raymond, I'm just interested in 8.1, and one of the submitters was talking about pop-up pools, and Maxine brought it up before as well. I understand the cement slurry and the herbicides, etc. I get that, but I'm picking, as Bruce mentioned there, pool water is reasonably innocuous, but is it the volume of the water that is the issue with pop-up pools rather than the contents? Or?
So I can probably just speak a little bit from experience. I've got a pop-up pool, and I know that when we empty it, it goes to the lawn. The ports are pretty small. They're probably about the diameter of
a hose.
Yeah, a hose, maybe slightly bigger, not much. The concern that was originally raised through that issue identification, but not post the public consultation, was around chemicals, and so that was probably first and foremost in our mind at the time.
Okay, so obviously you can't just clip the hose into the bottom of the pool, asking for a friend, and put it down to the gutter or to the stormwater. That in our ideal world, how do you drain a pool these days? Then,
so for pop-up pools,
yeah,
we just let it empty around us very, very slowly.
into the lawn.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that's
but I
preferable.
appreciate that with smaller property sizes these days and with concrete, that might not be achievable.
Right.
Where you haven't got a nice lawn to soak into.
Yeah.
In which case, I assume, but I don't know, that people would just drain it through a hose, potentially out to the gutter, and that's
Right.
not really something that
You
we want. We actually want it really to sort of go to land if it can.
Cool.
And then, into the wastewater system if it can.
Yep.
But because our focus really is, because the port's so small, so it's sort of volume is sort of controlled.
Yeah.
Our first and foremost thought really around those chemicals and not getting chlorine and algicides into the
Stormwater.
stormwater. So we need to have a think about how we can
Yeah, so
manage that.
if I can just ask one more, I don't mean to waste time. So ideally, how do you clip it into the wastewater as opposed to the stormwater? Like, do you put it into your toilet or?
So for so if we can sort of think about wastewater, like usually with those in-ground pools, they would need to be plumbed into the wastewater network. What we're grappling with now, and that was with one of the submissions, is where you've got existing pools that potentially are plumbed into the stormwater system, and that's where the comment came back around cost and the cost of actually replumbing it.
Right.
Under the building code, anything over 35,000 litres needs a resource consent, and to an approved site. The approved site is not mentioned in the building code. That's where this bylaw wants to pick up on that. It needs to go to wastewater.
Yeah, okay.
So, so yes, in terms of where you would drain your pool, your pop-up pool, need to have a think about that.
Yeah.
Potentially, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but
No.
I would probably need to ask some people back in our unit about whether, say, something like a gully trap would be suitable.
So I presume that would be part of the education program we put out when this goes through, rather than just creating a problem for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson.
Thanks, Ray, for these explanations, and I particularly liked your little joke. I'm not sure you knew you were making when you said we're not nailing our building site as well as
I
we'd
didn't.
like to.
I didn't actually.
I thought it was very subtle, very good. But that wasn't what I was going to ask for. There are a few questions that have come up from the submitters. The unmanned one, where they're saying and you're saying we have to have things on site to a certain amount of equipment or things like that on site to cope with any spillages. I don't see how that raised some red flags. I don't see if they're unmanned and unwoman presumably as well. So I don't see how an expectation could be put on the users of unstaffed petrol stations. You know, the Gull one, for instance, on Norton Road. If something happens there, is there an and the guy from the oil company mentioned the appropriate signage. Well, you know, how can that be what, you know, it drives our environmental standards for those? Shouldn't they have containment, physical containment things in place beforehand so that it doesn't rely on someone reading a sign and suddenly rushing around and diverting the spilt fuel somewhere or whatever like that? So I'm not sure how that works and whether our bylaw here is going to help that or do nothing for it, that situation.
That's where our pollution control plan was really going to, come into play. Where one of the pieces of information that we want in our pollution control plan is what does your site look like, and so some of that might be around, well, do you need bunding here? Do you need it graded a separate way? And that's where those site factors really come into play in terms of, as you quite rightly say, avoid it going down into a stormwater system.
So there's nothing at the moment in our current bylaw that helps with that then, potentially?
Oh, well, certainly our bylaw does help with that, because the change to this bylaw is that we're a lot more specific. Our previous bylaw said you must have a stormwater pollution control plan, period. The changes that we've made...
Sorry to interrupt, which would get reviewed when they looked at when they apply for a consent.
Yes, or when they went for a connection, yes.
Yep.
So, and so now we're being a lot more specific about what we're wanting. So just to give people a lot more clarity around our expectations in terms of the information that they need to supply us and what they need to think about. And so from that point of view, yes, we would be taking into account those kind of sites through that design. In terms of preventing a spill, if it can't be done through site design, because some things just do happen, despite good design, then, I mean, potentially, you know, we would need to have a look at, you know, does there need to be some sort of, you know, like builders use sediment socks to protect catch pits? Is there something, you know, almost like a life buoy, potentially? Yeah. But this is not something that I've investigated at this point, because our submitter has really just raised all these unmanned sites.
And because I'm looking at that particular gull station, I know how close it is to the Waterways Gully,
right,
for instance, and it's all downhill from that site to the gully, literally.
Right.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, how would the bylaw help if something happened at that site or a site like it?
If I could just add, I think it's really important, and the submitter raised the importance of the emergency response processes and equipment, etc. And a lot of that is so that if a spill occurs, it is actually notified to the right people so that they can come and respond. And those first responders need to understand the scope of what they're dealing with and where best to go to. And that's where the pollution control plans will be very, very useful in doing that. And that's why...
He made the point that some of those, I don't know whether it's the case there, but I think it might be, that monitored in headquarters in Auckland or somewhere like that. You know, so there's a fair few links in the chain before you get to the physical response.
Yeah, so it's really important to understand what level, what is that key information that is needed on the site, so someone can physically see it, whether it be the fire department, our first responders, Waikato Regional Council responders, etc. So it's just a number of people could need access to that information. So how do we make sure that they've got that access?
Look, going back to the first submitter there from the Fairfield project, I'm sort of quite familiar with parts of the Waterways Gully and some problems we've had in the past with stormwater related erosion and the control of that, so I'm just wondering, he described hundreds of points where stormwater is discharged from private properties, from roads and all sorts of things, and he mentioned would you say a 30 centimetre pipe coming under Comries Road, was it, to the gully, with taking water from council roads, I presume, or road reserves there. So what is there an onus on in the bylaw put on the exacerbator to control those flows so they don't cause erosion or problems with water quality that mixes into those streams?
Yes, as Bruce Mackay mentioned, there's a lot of existing properties that have these small stormwater discharges through to gully systems, and really depending on the geography, it might be quite difficult to divert. And so, I mean, we do have sort of stream and watercourse inspections. That
you have what, sorry?
Inspections where we kind of go up the watercourse, and and we basically have a look at our stormwater, council stormwater discharge outlets and culverts, and have a look at the condition of them and make sure that they aren't causing impacts. And we also have a look at what erosion is occurring, and there is a program of works where we want to address some of those erosion areas. I think we would have seen that probably come through the LTP process as well. We also have a stormwater master plan which looks at remediating the erosion. For the new catchments,
yes,
it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier if we can sort of actually stop it from happening in the first place. For the existing areas, it is harder. But I think we can perhaps go away and have a think about how we might pick up on some of those stormwater discharges from private property that go directly to that.
Because this point there would apply to every single gully in Hamilton, you'd imagine.
Yes, it would. It would. Yes, yes, it would.
Yeah. I'm thinking of that one in Hamilton West, Myrie, from about 5-6 years ago, where there was we ended up having to do a whole lot of remedial work down the back of, yeah. Myri was it?
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
Any
Can't remember
further,
the name.
any further questions, councillor McPherson?
Yeah, no, we're just having a chat here,
No,
thank you.
that's fine. Councillor Pascoe?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the work that you've done on this. Ray, just a question on responding to 8.7b about the on the premises manual. Would an online manual, in your view, satisfy that requirement in the same way of having the physical book there as it might on an older service station?
I think I think that what we've got for our pollution control plan information requirements could be held electronically by Hamilton City Council.
For each of the facilities?
For each of the facilities,
okay.
I don't have a problem with that. But as Myri said, I think it's really important for people to know what to do in the event of a spill.
Because it could be the fire people could be the first responders, couldn't they?
That's right, and you know, whether it's a phone, whether it's a sticker on those sites that basically says do this, call that person, this is the number.
Oh, so that could in fact be in place of a 30-page manual or whatever.
I think so. I think it's a response. Okay. It's the response. That's the outcome that we want. We want to stop.
Okay,
that.
So in other words, we could satisfy that requirement relatively easily from a compliance point of view.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah, so it's probably more about access, you know, making that information accessible rather than actually being physically available.
Yeah, so. Okay. Just in terms of this being part of a five-yearly cycle, are you confident that if this is approved, 5 years is still the appropriate cycle? And the reason I'm asking that question is, you know, there's a lot of changes happening here. I think the newest service station that's been approved is the Pack and Save one at Te Rapa, which is again an unmanned, unpersoned service station. So we would probably see that trend continuing and waiting, and the same with, and I'll come to a question on pools. Pools are probably the same. That waiting for 5 years to review this may in fact mean that we're continually behind the 8 ball in terms of having a policy that remains that is up to date in terms of compliance.
Right. If I can just clarify, so this stormwater bylaw was a new bylaw in 2015, and then we are required under the LGA to review it within 5 years to make sure that we have, you know, got it right. And thereafter, they are allowed to go to a 10-year cycle of review. However, we can review this bylaw at any time, and I agree with you, with so much change happening, and as I mentioned, as we learn how to give effect to the vision and strategy, and as Healthy Rivers plan change comes in from the Waikato Regional Council, and they're also doing a wider plan change, they're initiating that at the moment, and as we get clearer understanding around national policy statement for freshwater management, yes, I think we should be continually looking at whether this bylaw needs to be reviewed earlier, in alignment also with the other tools that we use, which are our regional infrastructure technical specifications, our district plan, all those kind of tools that we use to manage stormwater.
Okay, so you're confident there's enough flags going up around you to step in and say, you know, particular changes are needed within the bylaw to maintain that momentum of change happening?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Next question is about, do you think the bylaw is strong enough to give the council sufficient teeth for taking appropriate action when there are discharges? And I'm asking that question because our regional council currently shows no mercy to us when we digress or when we have accidents. So are we tightening the clause a little bit to make sure that we can act appropriately?
I think it gives us the teeth, but what we have put in a previous very recent submission for our water services bill is just highlighting that we need the ability to be able to do infringement notices, and that's a tool that we don't have at the moment. So, Amari, did you want to add to that at all?
No, so at the moment, I guess for any significant or transgression of our bylaw, we can take it through the courts as such, through prosecution, but we also in some cases need to rely on Waikato Regional Council's delegations around under the RMA to actually enforce, and so that's why we need to be working really closely with WRC just to make sure that we utilise their powers wherever we can.
Okay.
But Ray's quite right. There is no ability for those low level infringements to actually provide some disincentive through a penalty like an infringement.
So that connection is in the bylaw, is it, in terms of the connection back with the regional council?
It's not specifically stated, but it's implied, and it all comes down to the delegations under the Act. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
We also have a memorandum of understanding with Waikato Regional Council on how we might address contaminant discharges as well.
Okay. And my last question, if you'll indulge me, Chair, is around the pool owners. You know, given since this bylaw was last reviewed, we now have a 5-yearly inspection of swimming pools around the city being done somewhere else in the organisation. Does that inspection include looking at the wastewater, the stormwater, and how that is being discharged?
So I had a quick look at that, and that 5-yearly inspection seems to be focused on safety measures.
And fencing and that sort of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I believe that there's a really good opportunity that we should take up to have a look at other matters beyond that, just for efficiency.
So how do we enable that through the bylaw? Is that something you can do administratively within the organisation?
I think that's something that we would speak to whoever's going to be inspecting for the safety measures and just join up.
Okay.
And take that as an opportunity for public education as well.
Okay, and if I could add to that, because I have been, I've had some residents who have been subjected to those reviews, some good and some bad, that probably we need to make sure that we communicate that that's part of the review too, that's being done. But thank you for answering the questions.
Thank you. I now have Mayor Southgate, followed by Councillor Thompson and then Councillor Van Oosten. Mayor Southgate.
So Rob did pick up some of my questions at the higher level, and I'll come to that. Starting up with the high level stuff, how does this bylaw fit to upping our game, given that stormwater won't look anything like it currently does in the next review? So with any of the changes that you've put in, do they demonstrably take us towards higher standards of stormwater management?
I believe they do. They have certainly put more controls in place. They certainly allow us to go and inspect devices to make sure that they are functioning how they should be. So those are just two examples. They certainly now provide a whole lot more clarity. I felt that the last bylaw was so cleverly written to sort of capture everything, but it was really obscure to what the public actually needed to know. So we've got more detailed now so that there's much more clarity to the public and to industry around what our requirements are. So I think those things in themselves are really, really helpful.
Just in terms of how this sits within our building regulations and things from a consent point of view, I'm interested because not many years ago, more forward-looking businesses were attempting to do stormwater filtration through swales and other methods, and that was particularly difficult compared to putting it down a pipe and putting it down a grate. And given what the gentleman was saying about ecology and more natural waterways versus drains, have we looked at how this new bylaw will be more enabling with the building requirements in this council to enable people to move to those more ecologically friendly and more filtered stormwater solutions? Or could we?
Could we? So I hope I answer this correctly. So certainly the district plan is what will, I guess, control quite a few of those those matters around biodiversity and how you build and what measures you put in. This bylaw is really around making sure that those decisions that have been made through the district plan are upheld. We had a good look at how we could, I guess, have this support biodiversity, and so we are at the moment kind of sort of seeing what changes that we can do, that we can legally do within our, you know, our bylaw power, you know, making purposes. We do have to stick to a certain criteria when making these.
I'm sure. I guess my question is, can we raise this up and have a look at what's currently being exercised through the building unit? Because I will talk to you about one offline later that I think is a disgusting example of stormwater management, given that it only happened a couple of months ago on a residential site. One other question, and I'd like to remind me to do that because I've been meaning to do it. In terms of the people, well, obviously you can tell from my view that I'm thinking that natural watercourses are quite a different thing. So are we from pipes into stormwater drains? Does this allow, well, I suppose it's part of the same question, does this allow us to move to more natural and sustainable solutions? Because eventually we're going to have to filter pollutants out, not just control pollutants out.
Right. So again, that probably comes back to, say, for natural systems, for water-sensitive devices like rain gardens. So that, so rain gardens would have a filtering mechanism, and so this bylaw there supports us in being able to just go in and have a look and make sure that they're still working, and to sort of say to the public, coupled with an education strategy, because that's come through, you know, requirement for education on the requirement for them to check that as well. Are they, you know, are these devices draining properly? And if they're not, you know, what do you need to do about that? So in that way, this bylaw does support those kind of mechanisms. In terms of the distinction between drain and, say, watercourses, I completely agree with Bruce Mackay. You know, even if it's a drain and it was built to be a drain, it does attract you know, aquatic life, and they do need to be looked after. And so, in that respect, you know, we do have district plan rules, and Angus and I are looking at how we can support.
Okay, so the short answer is, if this council wants to focus on those outcomes, the ecology, either in a drain or a more natural solution, it needs to look to the district plan. I've had conversations with Bruno, David, etc. I know Sarah has too. You know, around upping our ante for because the NPS via biodiversity is always also going to impact on this. One more question though, in terms of the bylaw tackling those pollution prevention plans, which I think is a good step forward. It talks throughout of the owner or occupier. Is there, if I missed it, is there any reference to the person who has oversight of that particular aspect of the business? It seems to put all the onus back on the owner or occupier of the site, which on the one hand is okay, but how do we manage the performance of people? And I say this because I think it's often individuals who have been at the front end of a spill into the river, or a mistake, not turning something off, not cleaning something out. All of that. It always comes just as often a person fault, not a technical fault. So I'm wondering, does this go far enough to encourage the right kind of training or certification of people who manage significant sites as far as pollutants go?
There's possibly a gap in that regard. We have focused on the owner or occupier because they are at the coalface. They need to know what's on site that could address and how to respond.
So is it possible to put extra, although it hasn't gone out, so you haven't had any submitters to it, so it would be impossible to add a clause suggesting that the owner or occupier must take all reasonable steps to educate or educate the operator of the stormwater within site?
I think we should have a look at that.
Right. Any further questions?
Thank you. I made a good point. There we go.
No, and that's noted. I'm going to go to Councillor Thompson, then Councillor Van Oosten, and then Mangai Norm Hill. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Rowan. So, Ray, sorry. A couple of questions have been answered, but I'm just interested in the suggestion that builders should be or people working on building sites should be certified to ensure that they understand how to be disposing of pollutants. And there was another submitter who just gave a written submission who talked about having more education and the provision of sites for disposing of pollutants. So I think people, when they might just be even painting their house, whatever, they don't actually know what to actually do with those when they're washing stuff out or disposing of things.
Yes, so I think that in terms of builder certification, I think it's an idea. I think that submitter had sort of said for high risk sites or sensitive sites, it would be good to have builder certification. My first thought there was, I remember talking to an ecologist at Waikato Regional Council trying to ascertain where were the very, very special sites that we might need to focus our efforts. And he very passionately told me, how dare you try to choose one over the other? They're all special, they're all potential habitat. So I'd just like to just say that. So that might be an issue around builder certification and sensitive sites. We should all be treating them as habitat, either now or in the future. There are some other ways that we could do this, and this requires exploration. Just had a discussion the other day about that, and is that perhaps part of some building apprenticeship sort of training. So we need to look into that further. Sorry, what was your second point?
About education and disposal.
Yes, education. So certainly we've come away from this consultation exercise with a list of matters that we need to focus on for public education, and so that's work that will be done and will form part of a strategy going forward.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question to that is, do we, in order to be improving on the current situation, do we have sufficient resources for that monitoring of stormwater devices, of potential broken stormwater devices mentioned in regard to gullies and things, and that education work?
So we, as Ray indicated, we do stream assessments. So we have teams on the ground doing that work anyway, but we're not currently resourced to do more than really. We're focused on the actual waterway or drain in terms of the maintenance rather than the private connections going in. So that would have to be something that we would take further look at and determine what would be needed to undertake that work. In terms of education, we do have education strategies in place, But I think one thing that has come out of this consultation process is the need for that to be expanded, and that will be something that we will need to look at how we resource that. We also need to look at how we work with other partners and stakeholders like Waikato Regional Council, Waikato Tainui, stream care groups, etc. Because I think it's not something that Hamilton City Council can do on its own.
Okay, and is that something that it's possible to report back to us on within the coming months before LTP decisions in terms of, I guess, how we cooperate with others and where we may need to provide additional resource to actually implement, make this effective, this new bylaw changes?
I would suggest that we could probably allude to some of that in the deliberations report that goes to the April Infrastructure Operations Committee. If that would, I think that's probably the appropriate place to report back.
Okay, thank you. And the final question I had was just around, so I think there seems to have been some things raised in consultation which maybe aren't necessarily an issue for the bylaw, but a wider issue. And one was the amount of water stormwater being discharged into the gullies, and what work have we done to say, look at what it would actually cost to be retrofitting some of the more problematic discharge points in order to actually ultimately improve the health of these ecosystems and things.
I know that through stormwater master planning there has been a good look at what kind of retrofitting would need to occur over the city, knowing that we've got quite a large footprint where we don't have, I guess, the room to put in some, some stormwater management devices like wetlands. It's so much easier to do it in new catchments where you can plan for that land space. But I do believe that there is a closer look at where you might need to do something, and that might be in like high traffic volume areas where you have a lot more contaminants coming off tyres, etc. But I don't have the details, of the nature of that program and how that's landed in the LTP.
Okay, would it be possible to make a catch up for those interested, like a drop-in session to discuss more of those issues which may be more LTP related or more forward-looking in terms of beyond the bylaw?
Marie, do you want to pick that up? I know there's intense pressure. Sorry?
Mr Chair, I'm happy to talk to that because I've given staff instructions about briefings at the
No,
moment.
well, I've also mindful of talking to Eva Lisa this morning around staff pressure. So as chair of this committee, I don't want to unduly, and also deputy chair of infrastructure, I don't want to unduly put undue pressure. Marie, how could that be accommodated?
There is
Just for people to ask questions if they need to.
I'm just.
Mr Chair, it won't be happening before the deliberations of the long-term plan. We're maxed out with briefings. We really, really are maxed out.
Well, that's what I've just said with respect.
Yeah, so I think if Sarah would like this, we can. She should send a note to James, and we will schedule it on a briefing, which we've got a couple of things sitting in the wings, and it will occur after the LTP, in terms of how do we meet future stormwater standards that government expects.
And that won't interfere in any way with the deliberations report you'll prepare for the infrastructure. So that's out to the side.
I mean, it'll probably be something that the
Mayor has correctly identified some constraint pressures for us.
Yeah, I think in the deliberations report it will, when we talk about the impacts of the new bylaw, we can actually allude to the fact that that is something that needs further discussion and involvement with elected members.
Councillor Thompson, I assume you look happy, so that you're happy with that. Right, thank you. Councillor Van Oosten, followed by Mangai Hill. Councillor Van Oosten.
Thank you, Ray, for your report. in terms of the pop-up pools, and a lot of these questions have been asked and answered, but Bruce was a little unsure about the water and the chlorine that might be in it at the stage that they're emptied. But that, of course, there'll be some other chemicals, etc. I guess it depends on the number of pools that are around, the volumes that they're holding. What knowledge do we have of those pools? I understand that they don't have to have consents, etc., and they're becoming quite popular with families and being able to provide swimming options for their children.
That's where it would be really good to join up with those other inspections around safety so that we can quantify the number of pools. I don't have any numbers to be able to state now.
And in terms of the chlorine and other chemicals, what kind of analysis might be available to us to be able to really have an understanding about those impacts?
So there will be like NIWA, NZ guidelines on chlorine that will affect aquatic life, but if I can just say that Angus and I have done some research on how other cities and towns manage pool water, and Auckland has a unitary plan, as we know, and they do allow discharge. I mean, they certainly say that they want pool water going to wastewater, but they will allow discharge to the stormwater provided that chemicals are not added. I think it's either a week or 2 weeks, might be 2 weeks, prior to discharge to a stormwater network. So that will allow those chemicals to dissipate. Chlorine certainly breaks down in sunlight and over time. So that's how they manage it. Also Bay of Plenty guidelines.
So I just want to keep obviously focused on the bylaw in question. I realise that there's some other information drop-ins. Councillor Van Oosten?
Thank you for that. And do you believe that an education program would be able to highlight those points and give residents the opportunity to, really understand those issues?
I believe that should be a strong part of our strategy, yes.
Okay, look, and my final question is really with regard to the high-risk facilities and the staffed and unstaffed sites. I think you identified a really good sticker idea for the unstaffed. But in terms of the staffed sites, what requirement do we have of the users there for them to upskill, train and discuss the risks and issues with their staff? Understanding, of course, that these are lower paid workers and are often on a revolver of new staff coming into sites.
So there's nothing in the bylaw that would require that education component, and I think we should have another look at that. We do have staff that go to facilities to have a look at their, to basically monitor trade waste compliance as well as stormwater compliance, and they can ask to see a stormwater control plan, but I don't know what other questions they ask around that. So
possibly as part of the deliberations, in terms of the bigger picture, I think that's what Councillor Van Oosten is talking, is the bigger training and awareness picture. So I think we just have, we have to be a little bit careful in terms of the bylaw, but if there's some paragraphs here around the broader promotion education. Any further questions, Councillor Van Oosten, before I move on to Mangai Hill?
Really only in terms of that, so it would be possible for us to be able to extend that further, just like it is in the Health and Safety Act, requiring that the employer provide that level of training for their staff.
We'll certainly have a look at that, and of course the bylaw needs to go through a legal review prior to deliberations as well. So we'll.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mangai Hill?
Kia ora tātou, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep, kia ora, ngā me ki tēnei kaupapa. Just want to acknowledge Tim Manukau, lucky he had the words, because I thought was Dwayne The Rock Johnson on the screen. So acknowledgements to Tim. 4 questions. The discussions have been around quantity, quality, but I've got a couple of questions around Māori. And so in terms of quantity, we know that stormwater is a catchment or a result of hydrological activities. But in regards to the accumulative nature of what happens in Hamilton City Council and how it impacts on the other catchments, and here's an example. A lot of developments had occurred in Te Rapa and Rotorua, which impacts in terms of the stormwater on the Waikato District Council catchment with regards to the Tangiro wetland, which in turn has caused erosion on the banks of a marae called Waikiri. So my question there is, what implications does this bylaw have in terms of the wider catchment of other councils? And I've got 4 other questions as well.
Okay, so what this bylaw will do is it will make sure that when there are connections to the stormwater network, that these are aligned with integrated catchment management plans, that they are aligned with Te Ture Whaimana, and that they take into account comprehensive stormwater discharge consent requirements. So there's a section in there that is around connection approval. So what are we going to look at before we say yes to you? So that's one way of doing it, and that's how it sort of aligns with our district plan objectives as well.
Yep. Okay, thanks for that. Now, in terms of quality, there's been discussions around various measures of treatment. And so just in terms of tools of measurement, during consultation, or has there been any thought around cultural tools that measure quality of white?
So in terms of monitoring, that's something that we're looking at really closely right now. Certainly the bylaw, we give stronger recognition of the vision and strategy to Turi, and we have also put in our bylaw purpose the need to recognise Te Ture, and then we have backed that up with the likes of more contaminant controls, more ability for us to go and inspect devices to make sure that they're working. So in that regard, that's where the bylaw can operate. Outside of that, Hamilton City Council is doing some work around stormwater cultural monitoring. So this is quite a long piece of work that we started collaborating with iwi on about a year ago, and we're also going to hopefully take up some opportunities to work with Waikato Regional Council on that as well.
Yeah, and that's where my question was going in terms of the Mātauranga Māori monitoring, and we know that through the freshwater, the MPS through freshwater wetlands are significant, Mātauranga Māori is significant, it certainly aligns to the vision and strategy Te Mana o Te Wai, we era atu momo ture. So I just want to ask a question of Tim Manukau, if I can, Mr. Chairman, in regards to thoughts around cultural health indicators. And the reason being is that we know through the river settlement there was a scorecard regime that Tim was intimately involved in. So this could actually become the template or the exemplar for other councils to collectively achieve Te Mana o Te Wai and Te Ture Whaimana. So Tim, have you got some thoughts on that?
Kia ora everyone. Just wanted to say that cultural health monitoring of waterways is not just important for the stormwater, but goes beyond this particular project into other areas of freshwater. In terms of improving the mode of the waterways, the Waikato Tainui and DOC have been quite heavily involved in the review of the bylaw. We've had meetings with them in workshops, so they've given us a lot of feedback on mode. As you all know, they're very supportive of the health and well-being, and they want to actually improve the bylaw. So that first question you talked about in terms of looking at other catchments, one of the things that Waikato Tainui and DOC are looking at is setting a high benchmark for this stormwater bylaw, so that they can then engage with councils that fall within their other areas. So they want to use this bylaw as a good example, as a good benchmark to then build on reviewing other bylaws and other council jurisdictions that they're looking for. But on a whole, cultural health and wellbeing monitoring and measuring is quite important to Thorpe and to Waikato Tainui, and it's good to see that the council is working with them in that particular area.
Yep. Kia ora, Tim. And again, that's an extension of this question is around being that exemplar or leading in regards to this process. So in terms of the review, we talked about the 5-year review, and we know through technological changes globally how stormwater and managing water is significant across the world because of climate change. Do you think a 5-year review should be potentially a case by case in terms of that 5-year time frame being shorter?
I think where it's warranted, the bylaw could be reviewed by council should the need arise. The 5 years is regarded as a bit of a minimum, but if there's a need to review it, as Raymond was saying, there's an opportunity to review it there. I think one of the things that the mana whenua and Waikato Tainui has seen in this particular project, or particular review, is any learnings that they've gained from this bylaw review, then they can use that in other stormwater bylaw reviews that will occur in other councils. So look, we live in a small region, so it's about learning off each other and working with each other.
Thank you, Tim. Tēnā tautoko ki tērā whakaaro, so certainly support that. I know that Waipa is going through their stormwater processes now, and the learnings from this would be beneficial for other councils in terms of that collective integrated approach to managing our wai for the betterment of the receiving waterways and the moauri of the water and the people. Just one last question is around retrospective infrastructure improvements. Migratory fish, mata me era tuna, how a lot of the culverts are not conducive to supporting the life of our mainga kai. Yeah, thoughts on that?
Of restoration of those habitats, and in particular the mata and whitebait. Here we actually been quite intricately involved in those restoration initiatives. I've been working quite closely with Niwa along the Waikato River. So they're very supportive of any initiative that can protect the habitat of our taonga fish species, including supporting and improving the stormwater bylaw. They see it as a benefit to the restoration work that they're doing on our waterways, especially in the whitebait area. I think the tribe in Niwa have probably done more restoration research and actual physical works than a number of other organisations around the country. So that's ongoing.
Just if I can just add to that, we've sort of got sort of probably about a 3 or 4 pronged approach to that. So there's other tools that we use around that in terms of requiring fish passage. We also do fish passage inspections under our comprehensive stormwater consent, and then put them into a program of works where we can. And this bylaw says that you're not allowed to damage any fish passage that's there. So it's just a way of sort of trying to manage those connections.
Yeah. Final question. In terms of the education strategy, is it also focus on kaupapa or schools so that you're educating the next generation around these key responsibilities and behaviours?
I'm not...
Not currently, but it is definitely something that we should be considering as a way to reach the wider community, because through the youth of today is where the change happens for tomorrow. So.
Yeah, I see real good synergy with environment schools and other education regimes to grow the learning of the future champions of our world. So, tēnā koutou, kia ora, Tim. Tēnā koutou.
Right, thank you. Councillor Bunting, I understand, has indicated he's going to wishes to move the staff recommendation. Before we go there, I will just do a quick round, very quick round of the table and Zoom to see if there are any other additional points elected members of this committee wish to put in the deliberation report. Councillor McPherson had to pop out. Mayor Southgate.
Thank you, Chair Martin. I think it's been a really good discussion, and I think it's highlighted that I'm glad we picked up on the idea that we have to focus on people, not just the process, because people are always involved in that process, and we all make mistakes, so we need to deal with that. And also the second part that's important to me is that, you know, we're making this bylaw at this time. It's got to be able to be reviewed swiftly again if needs be, because the ground is the lay of the land's moving quite fast in terms of the three waters. Local government's particularly concerned about the costs coming our way with stormwater management. The whole country, there's considerable, and we need to be prepared to progress from today towards better stormwater management, because that's going to save us in the long run. If we have to retrofit everything further down the track, it's going to be more problematic to us. And so there again, I'm really looking forward to, don't want to rain on Sarah's parade, because I think the points that she raised are very good, and it is a discussion. I've suggested through her that there's a discussion potentially also for the Environment Committee at that high level. How do we up our game in terms of the management of stormwater into our catchment? How do we amend our district plan so in a way that gives better effect to those more natural qualities of water management? Because I've seen some pretty bad examples recently and over time. And I do like what the Waikato Regional Council, last point, Chair, what the Waikato Regional Council did in terms of incentivising good stormwater practice. They give out those soil management awards. I remember when I was at regional, and we should share those good examples. When I was at Regional Council, I was concerned about the amount of sediment getting into stormwater from the construction industry. And now they have requirements to bund and so on. But I have to say, some of that is really poor low-end management. Chucking a couple of sandbags loosely at the end of the slope, it doesn't do it. And I've seen streams of brown dirt going down the street. And last night, didn't it rain? So last night, it'd be interesting to now go to some of those places I know of and see what colour the water is running down the stormwater. And it comes off building sites, a lot of it in Hamilton. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going around those on Zoom. If there's any points that have not been discussed that you wanted added into the deliberations report. Councillor Kesh Naidu-Rolfe? No. Councillor Anja O'Leary? No. Councillor Sarah Thompson?
Yes, thank you. I guess it's been raised, but I'm not totally sure if it's been raised. It's just how do we bring together, say, both monitoring and education and information on what resources we might need, but how we better equip our building site monitors in this regard. And the other thing is if we are looking at more monitoring within the gully systems, it's also the issue of illegal vegetation clearance. How can we actually be kind of making the best use of resources in terms of having people monitor both that and stormwater issues at the same time? Well, I guess that's maybe, I don't know if that's fully within the scope of this, but it would mean making better use of resources in that regard. I think that's the only additional points.
All right, thank you. Mangai Hill?
No additional comment other than well done and painga mahi kurita.
Councillor Van Oosten?
Nothing more, just to echo the concerns of Mayor Southgate and Councillor Sarah with regard to building sites, sediment, etc., and treatment there, also of the education for workers within those sites as well. Thank you.
Right.
That's it.
Councillor Bunting, before he moves the motion, is there any additional points you want in the deliberations report before I hand over to you to formally move the motion?
Oh, okay. No, well, look, it will be pretty much the same as I was saying in my debate, so would you prefer it? I'll wait till then.
So the motion that Councillor Bunting is moving, can we place that up on the board, that the Hearings Engagement Committee receives a report, I assume has heard and considered the submissions to the proposed revised Hamilton Stormwater Bylaw, and notes that the deliberation report will be considered at the Infrastructure Operations Committee meeting of the 27th of April 2021. So moved by Councillor Bunting. Can I have a seconder, please? Seconded, Councillor Pascoe. Councillor Bunting.
Yeah, look, I'll be very, very brief because I realise time is short. My focus really is around, as Mayor Southgate said earlier on, about the people. If we are going to be changing the rules on pools, I think we're going to need to be not lenient but be respectful of people who have who are going to have some pretty significant costs if they're going to be replumbing their pools into the wastewater rather than the stormwater. I know a few, and this is certainly no criticism of staff, but a few complaints I've had and other councillors have had have been of the nature of those visits by pool inspectors, and they can be pretty intimidating and scary, largely because people don't know the rules. And so I figure the more information that you can put out with these changes, the more that someone with a pop-up pool knows what to do, then the less problems we're going to have. Because I think, I want to be part of an enabling group rather than a regulatory or penal group. So, if I had a pop-up pool, I would like to know where to drain it to be useful and helpful rather than to be prohibited from doing something. And look, just regarding briefings, I think we should have a briefing about our briefings and how many briefings we're going to have. So can we please schedule a briefing?
It's a procedure, it's not related, but it's a procedural motion, procedural. But I'm sure Her Worship will pick it up, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So happy to move.
Thank you. Second to Councillor Pascoe.
No, I have nothing to say.
Are there any further contributions before I put the motion? Looking at Zoom land there. No. Right. I will now put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand.
The motion is carried unanimously.
Mayor Paula, that we will come back at 11:30. Is that right? Here. Yes, 11:30.
I believe so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
We're doing it in here.
Yeah. My understanding is.